Welcome to Revenge Central. I hope you're doing well. Today I will read 10 short but interesting revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, and let's get started with Story 1. My grandmother got a phone call from what sounded, according to her, exactly like my voice, panicked and crying, saying I'd been in a car accident and needed money wired immediately to avoid being arrested. And she had already gone to her bank and withdrawn $6,000 in cash before a suspicious bank teller's gentle questioning made her pause long enough to call my actual phone and discover I was sitting at my desk at work, completely fine, having never made any such call at all. I want to explain the specific mechanism behind this, since understanding it changed how seriously I now take a category of scam I'd honestly dismissed before this happened, as something only a very specific kind of unsophisticated fraud, an obviously fake voice or a poorly acted script that any reasonably alert person would catch immediately. What actually happened to my grandmother involved AI voice cloning technology, which has become dramatically more accessible and convincing in recent years, allowing scammers to generate a synthetic voice closely mimicking a specific real person, using only a small sample of that person's actual voice. Sometimes as little as a few seconds pulled from a public social media video or voicemail greeting, technology that has moved from expensive, specialized capability to something available through consumer-accessible tools with genuinely alarming speed. I want to walk through what my grandmother actually experienced, since the specifics matter for understanding why this was so effective against someone who is, in every other respect, a sharp, capable woman who I would never have described as an easy scam target before this happened. The call came in on her landline, a voice she described as unmistakably mine, including specific verbal habits and tone that she recognized immediately, crying and panicked, saying I'd been in an accident, that I was at a police station, and that I desperately needed her to wire money to cover a specific fine, to avoid being formally arrested and held, with a second voice quickly taking over the call, presenting as a police officer or bail coordinator, providing specific wiring instructions, and creating a persistent, urgent pressure to act immediately rather than take any time to verify the situation independently. I want to describe how she later explained her own thought process during that call, since I think it's genuinely important for understanding why this works on intelligent, careful people rather than dismissing it as something that could only happen to someone naive. She said the voice sounded so completely, specifically like me, not a generic approximation, but my actual voice with my actual particular way of saying certain things, that the idea it might not actually be me never seriously entered her mind during the call itself. Her entire focus consumed instead by fear for my safety and an urgent desire to help as quickly as possible. She went to her bank, withdrew $6,000 in cash as instructed, since the caller had specifically said cash withdrawal followed by a specific money transfer service was required rather than any traceable bank transfer, a detail that, I now understand, is itself a recognized red flag scammers specifically rely on, since legitimate legal or law enforcement processes essentially never require this specific combination of urgent cash withdrawal followed by an untraceable transfer service. The bank teller who handled her withdrawal, and I want to give this specific person enormous credit, because her attentiveness is the entire reason this story doesn't end with my grandmother losing $6,000, noticed my grandmother's visibly distressed, panicked state during what should have been a routine withdrawal request, and gently asked what the funds were for, a question many tellers might not think to ask at all, given how routine cash withdrawals normally are. When my grandmother explained the situation, crying and distraught, the teller, who had apparently received some training on exactly this kind of emerging scam pattern, calmly suggested that before completing the transfer, my grandmother call her grandson directly, using a phone number she already had saved rather than any number provided during the original call, just to confirm the situation, framing it gently as a precaution rather than casting doubt on what my grandmother believed had happened. That single suggestion, call using a number you already have saved rather than trusting any information from the call itself, is what broke the scam entirely. My grandmother called me directly, and I picked up at my actual desk, confused and immediately alarmed to hear how distraught she sounded, having no idea what she was talking about until she managed to explain through her panic, at which point I was able to confirm, immediately and completely, that I had never called her, was not in any accident, and was not, in any sense, in police custody anywhere. I want to describe the specific horror of realizing, in that moment, how close my grandmother had come to losing a genuinely significant amount of money, and how completely, viscerally convincing this scam had been for her, despite her being, in absolutely every other context I can think of, a careful, skeptical, sharp woman who reads news about scams regularly and has warned other family members about far less sophisticated attempts over the years. Once we confirmed she was safe and the money had not actually been sent, we reported this immediately to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, specifically flagging it as an AI voice cloning-enabled fraud attempt, a category the FBI has, in recent years, specifically begun tracking and issuing public warnings about given how rapidly it's grown as a fraud vector. Since the underlying technology's increasing accessibility has made this kind of scheme dramatically more scalable and convincing than the older, more generic grandparent scam scripts that relied purely on a stranger's voice and some educated guessing about family relationships. I also reported it to our local police department, providing the same details, and, separately, spent real time afterward trying to understand exactly how the scammers might have obtained a usable sample of my actual voice in the first place, since AI voice cloning of this quality generally requires some genuine audio sample to work from, rather than being generated purely from nothing. I have a modest public presence through some work-related video content and a few public social media posts that include my voice, any of which could plausibly have provided enough of a sample for this specific technology to work from, a realization that was genuinely unsettling, understanding that something as ordinary as a public video clip could become raw material for exactly this kind of targeted fraud against people I love. I want to describe what our family did afterward, since I think the practical response matters more than any specific enforcement outcome, especially given how difficult these scams generally are to actually trace and prosecute, since they typically originate from operations specifically structured to be difficult to locate or hold accountable, often operating across international jurisdictions, with minimal realistic prospect of the specific perpetrators ever being identified or charged. A frustrating reality my grandmother's local police detective was honest with us about from the beginning, rather than offering false hope of a clean resolution. What we did instead, as a family, was establish a specific verification protocol going forward, a private, family-only code word that any of us would need to provide if ever calling another family member in genuine distress, requesting money, or any urgent action. A word never shared anywhere publicly or digitally, existing purely as a verbal verification tool specifically designed to defeat exactly this kind of impersonation, since even a perfect voice clone cannot produce a specific piece of information it was never given access to in the first place. We also had a broader family conversation, prompted directly by this experience, establishing a simple, universal rule that any call involving a request for urgent money transfer, regardless of how convincing or how emotionally urgent it sounds, gets a mandatory pause and a callback to the supposedly distressed family member using an independently known phone number, never a number provided during the call itself, before any money moves anywhere, a rule that costs nothing and takes only a few extra minutes, but that would have been the second, independent line of defense even if the specific bank teller hadn't happened to ask the right question at exactly the right moment. I want to end on the thing that I think matters most for anyone reading this, with an older parent or grandparent in their life. This technology is genuinely, dramatically better and more accessible than most people assume, and the old advice about listening carefully for something that sounds slightly off or robotic in a scam caller's voice is, unfortunately, becoming considerably less reliable protection than it used to be. The actual, durable protection isn't a sharper ear. It's a predetermined, agreed-upon verification habit that doesn't depend on how convincing any specific call sounds in the moment. A family code word, a strict callback rule, something established calmly in advance, rather than something you're relying on your own judgment to invent, under the exact kind of panicked, emotional pressure this scam is specifically engineered to create. Story 2. I bought my nephew a $100 gift card off the rack at a regular grocery store for his birthday, and when he tried to use it 2 days later, it showed a zero balance, already spent on something neither of us had ever purchased, hours before he'd even opened the card, which sent me down a path of learning about a specific, low-tech scam that exploits something genuinely simple about how gift cards sitting on open retail racks actually work. And that ended with me helping a store manager and a loss prevention investigator trace the exact scheme back to a pattern affecting dozens of other customers at that same location. I want to explain the mechanism first, since understanding it changed how I think about buying any gift card off an open rack ever again. Gift cards sold on those open, unlocked retail racks typically have both a visible card number and a scratch-off panel covering a separate security PIN code, both of which are printed directly on the physical card before it's ever purchased, activated, or loaded with any value. The scam exploits the fact that anyone with access to that rack before a card is purchased can record both numbers, either by carefully scratching off and later concealing the PIN panel, or, more commonly in newer versions of this scam, simply photographing the card number and using a small handheld device to read the PIN encoded beneath a still intact-looking scratch panel, without the card ever appearing tampered with to a normal customer glancing at it before purchase. Once a scammer has both numbers recorded from an unpurchased card still sitting on the rack, they simply monitor that specific card number periodically, checking its balance through the retailer's own public gift card balance lookup tool, which most major retailers offer online specifically for customer convenience. The moment an actual customer purchases and activates that specific card, giving it real monetary value for the first time, the scammer, watching for exactly that activation, immediately drains the balance themselves, often within minutes, before the actual purchasing customer ever has a chance to use it at all. I did not know any of this the day I bought my nephew's card, obviously, and simply assumed, when he told me the card showed a zero balance, that something had gone wrong with the store's own activation process. A frustrating but seemingly mundane technical glitch, rather than anything resembling deliberate theft. I called the retailer's gift card customer service line, prepared for a routine, if annoying, resolution process. What I learned on that call, once the representative actually pulled up the card's specific transaction history, rather than just confirming the current zero balance, was that the full $100 value had, in fact, been spent entirely online at an unrelated retailer within about 90 minutes of my in-store purchase, a transaction that obviously neither my nephew nor I had made, since we'd been nowhere near a computer making any online purchase during that window, having simply bought the physical card and then, days later, tried and failed to use it. I want to describe the specific frustration of that initial call, since the representative, while polite, initially treated this as a fairly routine dispute process, taking my report and indicating it would be reviewed, without giving me much confidence that this would actually be resolved rather than simply logged and forgotten. I asked, specifically, whether this pattern, a card being drained by an unrelated online purchase almost immediately after in-store activation, was something they'd seen before, a question that got a noticeably more careful, measured response than I expected, suggesting to me that this was, in fact, a recognized pattern rather than some entirely novel occurrence unique to my specific card. I want to describe what I did next, since I think it mattered for how this eventually got resolved beyond just my own $100. I went back to the specific store where I'd purchased the card and asked to speak with the manager directly, explaining what had happened and specifically asking whether they'd had any similar complaints recently regarding gift cards purchased from that same physical rack location. The manager, to her credit, took this seriously immediately and mentioned, once I described the specific pattern, that she had, in fact, fielded a small handful of vaguely similar complaints over recent weeks, though none of the customers involved had connected the dots as specifically as I was now describing, and she'd been treating each one as an isolated, individual dispute to be forwarded to the gift card program's own customer service, rather than recognizing a potential pattern specific to their store's physical rack. She looped in the store's loss prevention team, who, once presented with several complaints clustered around the same general time frame and, notably, several cards from the same general area of that specific rack, pulled the store's own security camera footage covering that rack area for the relevant weeks, and found, reviewing it carefully, a specific individual visiting the rack repeatedly over several weeks, spending noticeably longer at the display than a typical customer selecting a card normally would, on several occasions appearing to handle multiple cards briefly before replacing them and leaving without making any purchase at all, a pattern entirely consistent with someone recording card numbers and pins rather than actually shopping. I want to describe how satisfying it was to actually see this pattern confirmed on camera, transforming what had felt like an isolated, frustrating, and slightly embarrassing mishap involving my nephew's birthday gift into something that was clearly, demonstrably, a deliberate, sustained scheme targeting multiple customers at that specific location over an extended period. The loss prevention investigator, once this pattern was confirmed, involved local law enforcement, providing the security footage and the pattern of affected gift card complaints as supporting evidence, which led to an investigation identifying the individual from the footage, resulting in criminal charges for what amounted to a sustained pattern of gift card fraud affecting, once fully tallied by the investigation, considerably more victims and dollar value than just my own $100 card, since the same individual's footage pattern connected to at least a dozen other confirmed drained cards from that same store over roughly a 2-month window once loss prevention went back through the full available footage history. I want to be honest that recovering my own specific $100 once this broader investigation confirmed the pattern was actually the easiest part of the entire process, since the retailer, once presented with clear evidence that this was part of a documented fraud pattern rather than an isolated dispute, refunded the full amount to a replacement card for my nephew without any further argument, a resolution considerably smoother than the initial, somewhat non-committal customer service call had suggested might be necessary. I want to spend the last part of this on the practical lesson, since it's genuinely simple and, I think, not something most people, myself very much included before this happened, ever think to do when buying a gift card off an open store rack. Retailers who sell gift cards on open, unsecured racks are, increasingly, aware of exactly this vulnerability, and some have started implementing countermeasures, cards sealed in tamper-evident packaging that makes covert number and PIN recording considerably harder, or racks positioned in more actively monitored areas of the store. But absent those specific protections, the single most useful thing an ordinary customer can do is examine the card's scratch-off PIN panel carefully before purchase, looking specifically for any sign it may have been previously scratched and then recovered, even subtly, and, ideally, choosing cards from further back in a rack stack rather than the most visible, easily accessible ones at the front, since those front-facing cards are, unsurprisingly, the ones most convenient for anyone looking to record numbers without drawing attention to themselves. I also now, for any gift card I buy for anyone, check the balance online myself immediately after purchase, before ever handing the card over as a gift, a habit that costs about 30 seconds and that would have caught this specific situation the same day, rather than leaving my nephew disappointed on his actual birthday, waiting 2 days to discover a gift that had already been silently emptied by someone else before he'd ever had a chance to use a single dollar of it himself. Story 3. I picked up my car from valet parking at a restaurant after a nice anniversary dinner and noticed it had 43 more miles on the odometer than when I'd handed over the keys 2 hours earlier, along with a faint smell of cigarette smoke. I don't smoke and my wife doesn't either, and it took a dash cam I'd forgotten was even recording, plus a genuinely useful GPS tracking feature built into my car's own manufacturer app to confirm that the valet attendant had taken my car on an extended personal joyride during our dinner, something that, once I dug into it, turned out to be a pattern this specific valet company had a documented history of complaints about. I want to describe the exact moment I noticed the mileage discrepancy, since it's the kind of thing that's genuinely easy to miss if you're not someone who happens to pay attention to your odometer reading, which I only was that particular evening because I'd glanced at it earlier that day for an entirely unrelated reason, noting the specific number in my head almost automatically the way you do sometimes with small, meaningless details that happen to stick. Getting the car back from the valet stand, I noticed the odometer reading immediately looked wrong relative to what I remembered from earlier, a discrepancy that would have meant driving roughly 43 miles during the 2 hours my car had supposedly been sitting in a nearby parking structure the restaurant used for valet overflow. I mentioned this to the valet attendant on duty at pickup, a different person than the one who'd taken my keys at drop-off, who seemed genuinely confused and had no immediate explanation, suggesting perhaps I was misremembering the original reading, a suggestion I was fairly confident was wrong, but that I didn't have any immediate way to definitively disprove on the spot. I want to describe the specific detail that ended up mattering enormously, which is that my car has a built-in dashcam system, something I'd had installed years earlier and had, admittedly, mostly forgotten was actively recording during ordinary daily use, since I'd installed it originally with an eye toward accident documentation rather than any specific concern about valet situations. That dashcam, recording on a rolling loop, had captured footage from the entire period my car had been out of my possession, since the loop retention window was long enough to cover the roughly 2 hours of our dinner. I want to describe what that footage actually showed, once I got home and pulled it up, still confused and a little shaken by the smell of smoke in a car neither my wife nor I use for that. The footage showed the valet attendant who'd taken my keys at drop-off, getting into the driver's seat almost immediately after we walked into the restaurant. But rather than driving the short distance to the restaurant's designated overflow parking structure, driving instead onto a nearby highway, continuing for a period of roughly 40 minutes before eventually pulling into what appeared to be a personal residence, where the footage showed him going inside briefly, then returning to drive back, again via the highway, arriving back near the restaurant with enough time to reasonably discreetly have the car appear to be exactly where it should have been by the time we came out for pickup. I want to describe the specific mix of anger and, honestly, disbelief at the sheer audaciousness of what the footage showed, an employee entrusted with a guest's vehicle for the explicit, sole purpose of parking it safely, instead using that window to run what looked very much like a personal errand at what I have to assume he believed was essentially zero risk of ever being discovered, given how few people, reasonably, think to check their own odometer reading before and after a routine valet parking experience. I brought this footage directly to the restaurant's management the following day, along with the specific mileage discrepancy and my own account of the smoke smell, which management, to their credit, took seriously immediately, though I want to note that the restaurant itself contracted with a separate, third-party valet parking company rather than employing valet staff directly, meaning the actual employer relationship and accountability, once this escalated, involved that separate valet company rather than the restaurant itself, even though the restaurant had its own reputational stake in making sure this got addressed properly, given that the incident had happened under their roof, using their contracted service. The valet company's initial response, once the restaurant looped them in, was notably less immediately cooperative than the restaurant's own reaction had been, with an initial suggestion that the mileage discrepancy might reflect some kind of normal parking structure navigation inefficiency, a suggestion that fell apart entirely once I actually showed them the dashcam footage itself, rather than just describing the discrepancy in the abstract, since footage of their employee driving onto a highway and visiting what was clearly a personal residence is not something any reasonable person could characterize as ordinary parking structure navigation. Once presented with the actual footage, the valet company's posture shifted considerably, and this is where I learned something I hadn't expected going in, which is that my own car's manufacturer app, something I use mostly for remote locking and basic diagnostics, includes a GPS location history feature that, once I actually checked it against the dashcam's timeline, provided an independent, second data source corroborating the exact route shown in the dashcam footage, the highway detour, the residential stop, and the return trip, all matching the GPS breadcrumb trail stored automatically by my car's own connected services, giving me two entirely independent sources of evidence rather than relying on the dashcam footage alone, which mattered considerably for how seriously the situation was taken once both were presented together. The valet company terminated the specific attendant once their own internal review confirmed what the footage and GPS data showed, and offered to cover the cost of the excess mileage's wear impact on my vehicle, along with a modest compensation for the overall experience. An offer I did not think was remotely sufficient once I learned, through a conversation with the restaurant's general manager who mentioned it somewhat reluctantly, that this specific valet company had apparently had at least 2 prior complaints from other guests over recent months involving unexplained mileage or fuel level discrepancies, complaints that, as far as I could tell, had been quietly resolved individually without any broader pattern ever being formally investigated or reported anywhere beyond an internal, informal note within the valet company's own files. That detail, once I learned it, changed how I approached seeking accountability, since it suggested this wasn't a single rogue employee's isolated bad decision, but potentially a broader pattern the valet company had quietly been managing through individual settlements, rather than actually addressing systematically. I filed a police report specifically framing this as unauthorized use of a vehicle, which in most jurisdictions is a real, chargeable offense distinct from the civil question of compensation for any resulting wear or damage, since what happened to my car met the legal definition of taking a vehicle without the owner's consent for a purpose entirely unrelated to what consent had actually been given for, regardless of whether the vehicle was ultimately returned undamaged. That police report, combined with both the dashcam footage and the corroborating GPS data, resulted in the attendant facing an actual criminal charge for unauthorized vehicle use, a genuinely different level of consequence than simply losing his job, which I felt was appropriate given both the clear evidence and my growing understanding that this may not have been an isolated incident for him specifically. I also filed a complaint with our state's Consumer Protection Division, specifically regarding the valet company's apparent pattern of quietly resolving prior similar complaints without any broader investigation or accountability measure, which prompted, as far as I was able to follow up on afterward, the company implementing a mandatory GPS tracking requirement on all vehicles during valet custody going forward. A policy that, frankly, should have existed from the beginning given how directly it protects both guests and, honestly, the valet company itself from exactly this kind of liability. I want to end on the practical lesson here, which is genuinely simple, but that I never would have thought to actively apply before this happened. If your vehicle has any kind of dashcam or connected GPS tracking feature through its manufacturer app, and you're ever handing your keys over to any valet service, it costs nothing to glance at your odometer reading before you walk away, a habit that takes about 2 seconds, and that, in my case, was the single detail that turned a vague, unprovable suspicion about a strange smell into a fully documented case with 2 independent, corroborating sources of evidence, resulting in real accountability for something that, without that one small habit, would very likely have simply been dismissed as my imagination, or an honest misunderstanding. Exactly the outcome a certain kind of valet attendant, apparently, has learned to comfortably count on. Story 4. I hired an online tutor for my teenage son's advanced calculus class, someone whose profile claimed a graduate degree in mathematics from a well-regarded university and years of experience teaching exactly this specific curriculum, paid a premium hourly rate for that specific expertise over 4 months, and eventually discovered, once my son's actual grades kept declining, despite weekly sessions, this tutor consistently described as going well, that the graduate degree was entirely fabricated, and the tutor's actual mathematical understanding of the material was, based on what I eventually pieced together, considerably weaker than my son's own. I want to walk through how I chose this tutor, since I did what felt like reasonable due diligence at the time, using a tutoring marketplace platform that displays reviews, listed credentials, and a general profile description. Selecting someone whose profile specifically claimed a master's degree in applied mathematics, several years of experience tutoring advanced high school and early college-level calculus specifically, and a handful of positive reviews from other parents praising clear explanations and patience with struggling students. The sessions themselves, for the first couple of months, seemed reasonable enough from what I could observe secondhand, my son reporting that sessions felt productive, the tutor sending brief weekly summary notes describing topics covered and areas of continued focus, the kind of routine, unremarkable progress reporting that gave me no specific reason to question anything. The thing that first made me pause was my son's actual grades, which continued a slow, steady decline despite 4 months of what was supposedly targeted expert tutoring specifically addressing his struggles. I want to be fair and note that tutoring doesn't always produce immediate dramatic results, and I initially attributed the continued struggle to the material itself simply being genuinely difficult, or perhaps some mismatch between the tutor's teaching style and how my son personally learned best. Entirely plausible explanations that didn't require assuming anything was wrong with the tutor's actual competence or honesty. What actually pushed me to look closer was sitting in, unannounced, on part of one session, something I generally avoided doing specifically to give my son space and privacy during his tutoring, but that I decided to do that particular week purely out of curiosity about the format, rather than any specific suspicion. What I observed, watching for maybe 15 minutes, was a tutor who seemed to be working through practice problems alongside my son in real time, in a way that felt less like an expert efficiently guiding a struggling student toward understanding, and more like two people of roughly comparable uncertainty working through unfamiliar material together, including a moment where the tutor got visibly stuck on a specific technique and, after a noticeably long pause, arrived at an approach that, when I checked it against my son's actual textbook later that evening, was not just inefficient, but actually mathematically incorrect for that specific type of problem. I want to describe the specific unease of that realization, since it's one thing to suspect a tutor isn't a perfect teaching match for your child, and another entirely to suspect the tutor may not actually understand the material at a level meaningfully beyond what they're supposedly teaching. I did not confront the tutor immediately, wanting to gather more specific evidence rather than act on a single 15-minute observation that could, in theory, reflect an off day rather than a genuine competence gap. I reviewed the tutor's weekly summary notes more critically over the following sessions, and noticed, once I was actually looking for it, a pattern of somewhat vague, generic language describing topics covered, without the kind of specific, technically precise detail I'd expect from someone with genuine graduate-level mathematical training discussing a subject they'd supposedly taught for years, phrasing that felt more like it was describing the general shape of a calculus curriculum from a textbook table of contents than reflecting actual deep, specific engagement with the material. That pattern, combined with the specific incorrect technique I'd witnessed directly, gave me enough concern to actually verify the credential itself, rather than continuing to rely on the platform's own displayed profile information. I contacted the university the tutor's profile claimed the graduate degree came from, specifically their registrar's office, which most universities will confirm degree conferral information for, within reason and with appropriate identifying details, precisely because degree verification requests are a routine, expected function most universities handle regularly for employers and others needing to confirm someone's claimed credentials. The registrar's office, after I provided the tutor's full name and the specific degree and graduation year listed on their platform profile, confirmed they had no record of any student matching that name having ever been enrolled in or graduated from their graduate mathematics program at all. A definitive institutional confirmation that the specific credential this tutor had used to justify both their hiring and their premium hourly rate simply did not exist. I want to describe what I did with this information, since I felt a genuine obligation to act on it beyond just quietly stopping the tutoring arrangement for my own son. I reported the fabricated credential directly to the tutoring platform, providing the registrar's confirmation, since these platforms generally do have policies requiring accurate credential representation and processes for removing tutors found to have misrepresented their qualifications. Given how directly parents rely on stated credentials, specifically to make hiring decisions for something as consequential as their children's academic support. The platform's investigation, once I provided the registrar confirmation, resulted in the tutor's profile being removed entirely within about a week, along with, notably, the platform reaching out to me to ask whether I'd be willing to provide details for what they described as a broader review of the account, since credential misrepresentation of this kind, once confirmed for one specific claim, often prompts a platform to examine whatever other claims exist on that same profile with similarly increased scrutiny. I want to be honest that I don't know the full outcome of that broader platform review beyond my own specific tutor being removed, since the platform, reasonably, did not share details of any other credential findings with me as an outside reporting party. What I did pursue for my own specific situation was a refund request for the sessions paid over those 4 months, framed specifically around the fact that the premium rate charged had been directly justified by a credential that turned out to be entirely fabricated, meaning the value proposition I'd paid for, expert graduate-level mathematical instruction, had never actually existed as represented. The platform, once presented with the registrar's confirmation, agreed to refund a substantial portion of what I'd paid, citing their own policy regarding services obtained under materially false credential claims, a resolution I felt was reasonable given the platform's own cooperative response, once presented with clear, institutional documentation rather than merely my own subjective assessment of the tutor's competence. The part of this that actually mattered most, though, was addressing the real, tangible harm to my son. 4 months of a school year spent believing he was receiving expert help while actually receiving instruction of uncertain, and in at least one documented instance actively incorrect, quality, compounding rather than resolving his original struggles with the material. We found a new tutor, this time through a referral from his actual school's math department rather than an open online marketplace. And I want to note something the new tutor pointed out gently but directly during their first session together, that my son had apparently absorbed and internalized at least one specific incorrect technique from the previous tutoring, requiring some deliberate unlearning before correct instruction could actually take hold. A genuinely frustrating discovery given how much time and money had already gone into what turned out to be actively counterproductive instruction rather than merely ineffective instruction. I want to end on the practical lesson, since I think it's broadly useful for anyone hiring any kind of tutor, consultant, or specialist based primarily on a stated credential displayed on an online platform profile. Verifying a claimed degree directly with the issuing institution's registrar office is a genuinely simple, quick process, typically a single phone call or email, and one that most parents, myself included before this happened, simply never think to do, trusting instead that a platform's own review or vetting process has already handled that verification on our behalf. Many platforms, I learned through this experience, do not independently verify every credential claim made on every profile, relying instead on a general honor system backed by after-the-fact review only once a specific complaint or concern is raised, meaning the actual verification burden, in practice, often falls entirely on the individual parent or client, whether or not that expectation is made clear anywhere in the platform's own marketing about how carefully its tutors are vetted. Story 5. 6 of us split a 40-minute commute through a van pool arrangement for almost 2 years, each contributing a monthly amount specifically meant to cover gas, van maintenance, and a modest parking fee at our office garage. And it took a genuinely unplanned schedule change to reveal that our coordinator, the guy who handled all the actual bookkeeping and vendor payments, had been pocketing a meaningful chunk of our monthly contributions by paying our maintenance shop and parking garage considerably less than what he told the rest of us those costs actually were. I want to explain the setup because I think it matters for understanding how this went unnoticed for as long as it did. Our company offered a modest subsidy toward van pool arrangements as part of its commuter benefits program, which covered a portion of the lease cost on the van itself, with the remaining costs, gas, routine maintenance, and a monthly parking arrangement at a garage near our office, split evenly among the 6 of us riding it regularly. Our coordinator, I'll call him Ray, had proposed the whole arrangement originally, had the relevant contacts at the maintenance shop and garage from some unrelated context, and volunteered to handle all the actual logistics and payments, collecting a monthly contribution from each of us and handling the rest himself, a division of labor that felt, honestly, like a genuine favor at the time, since none of us particularly wanted to deal with the administrative side of arranging maintenance and parking ourselves. For close to 2 years, this worked without any of us questioning it much, since Ray reported monthly costs that felt reasonable enough, given rough market rates we vaguely understood for parking and maintenance in our area, and the van itself ran fine, got serviced regularly enough that nothing ever broke down unexpectedly, and generally gave us no specific reason to scrutinize the underlying numbers more closely. The thing that actually revealed the discrepancy happened almost entirely by chance. One of our vanpool members, I'll call her Priya, needed to park her own personal car at that same garage for an unrelated reason one weekend, and, while paying for that separate visit, ended up chatting with the garage attendant about parking rates generally, mentioning our vanpool's monthly arrangement in passing. The attendant, without any particular reason to be cagey about it, quoted her the actual monthly rate for a vehicle in our specific arrangement, a number meaningfully lower, by close to a third, than what Ray had been telling us our monthly parking cost actually was. Priya mentioned this to me and one other rider the following week, more out of simple confusion than any specific suspicion at that point, since there were plausible innocent explanations. Maybe Ray had negotiated a different rate at a different point in time. Maybe there was some additional fee or service included in our arrangement that the attendant simply hadn't mentioned in a casual conversation. But it was enough of a discrepancy that the three of us decided, quietly among ourselves before saying anything to Ray directly, to actually look into the maintenance costs as well, since if the parking number was inflated, it seemed worth checking whether the maintenance numbers were accurate too. One of our other riders, it turned out, had a cousin who worked at the same maintenance shop Ray used for the van's regular servicing, a connection none of us had thought to leverage before since we'd simply trusted Ray's monthly cost reporting without much scrutiny. That cousin, once asked casually about typical costs for the specific kind of routine service our van received, confirmed a number for a standard service visit considerably lower than what Ray had consistently reported to us as our monthly maintenance contribution over the better part of 2 years. I want to describe the specific, quiet unease of putting these two discrepancies together, since neither one alone would have felt damning, but together, a meaningfully overpriced parking figure and a meaningfully overpriced maintenance figure, both benefiting the same person who happened to be the sole point of contact and sole handler of our collective monthly payments, started looking less like a coincidence and more like an actual pattern. The four of us who'd pieced this together decided, before confronting Ray directly, to actually gather concrete documentation rather than approach him with secondhand conversations alone, since we recognized that a garage attendant's casual quote and a maintenance shop employee's rough recollection, while suggestive, weren't quite the same as actual invoices we could point to directly. One rider, with a legitimate reason given her own connection at the maintenance shop, was able to obtain copies of our van's actual service invoices directly from her cousin, showing the real costs charged for each service visit over the prior year. Separately, another rider requested a formal, written parking rate confirmation directly from the garage's management office, citing our vanpool's specific arrangement, rather than relying on the earlier casual attendant conversation alone. Once we had these two sets of actual documentation in hand, the comparison against what Ray had collected and reported to us monthly over that same period was stark. Across roughly 18 months of documented invoices we were able to obtain, the actual combined parking and maintenance costs came to a total meaningfully lower, by several $1,000s cumulatively across all 6 of us, than what Ray had collected from the group specifically earmarked to cover those exact costs. I want to describe the confrontation itself, since it did not go quite the way any of us expected. We approached Ray as a small group, calmly, presenting the actual invoices and the garage's written rate confirmation, asking him directly to explain the discrepancy between what these documents showed and what he'd been collecting and reporting to us monthly. Ray's initial response was defensive, citing vague, unspecified additional costs, occasional extra services, a supposed buffer for unexpected repairs that he claimed justified the higher monthly collection, an explanation that might have held some water if he'd been able to point to any specific documentation of his own, supporting those claimed additional costs, which he was not able to produce when directly asked. Faced with our actual documented invoices contradicting his explanation, and no corresponding documentation of his own to support the additional costs he was claiming, Ray eventually admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had been rounding up our monthly contributions considerably beyond actual costs for close to the entire duration of the van pool, describing it, in his own framing, as compensation for his time and effort coordinating the whole arrangement, a role none of the rest of us had ever agreed should come with any kind of hidden financial premium on top of our actual shared costs, since the entire van pool had been proposed and understood, from the beginning, as a cost-sharing arrangement, rather than one where the coordinator was entitled to secretly profit from the difference between real and reported expenses. I want to be fair and note that a coordinator doing genuinely more administrative work than everyone else, asking, openly and directly, for some kind of modest additional compensation for that time, would have been a completely reasonable thing to propose and negotiate as a group. And several of us said as much to Ray directly, that our actual objection wasn't to him being compensated for his effort in some fair, transparent way, it was specifically to him doing so secretly, through inflated cost reporting, rather than through any honest conversation the rest of us could have actually agreed to or declined. We resolved this, ultimately, without pursuing any kind of formal legal action, given the relatively modest total amount involved once split 6 ways, and the practical reality that continuing to work and commute alongside these same people made an amicable resolution considerably more valuable than a drawn-out dispute. Ray agreed to reimburse each of us our proportional share of the over-collected amount from the documented 18-month period, paid out over a few months, and the van pool itself transitioned to a new coordination structure where a different writer now handles the actual payments, with all invoices shared transparently in a group folder any of us can check at any time. A level of transparency that, frankly, should have existed from day one, but that none of us thought to insist on until we had a very specific reason to. I want to end on the practical lesson here, since I think it applies well beyond van pools specifically to any informal group arrangement where one person handles collective money and reports costs back to the group without any independent verification built into the process from the start. It is not distrustful or excessive to ask, periodically, to see actual invoices or receipts for shared expenses being managed on your behalf by someone else, even a friend. Even someone you have no specific reason to suspect of anything. Because the entire vulnerability in a situation like ours wasn't Ray being an unusually deceptive person from day one. It was 6 adults collectively deciding, without ever quite deciding it consciously, that asking to see the actual numbers felt like an insult to someone doing us all a favor. Right up until one chance conversation at a parking garage revealed that the favor had quietly come with an unspoken, unauthorized markup the entire time. Story 6. I want to tell you about the year our community garden's plot committee chairwoman waged a quiet, deeply petty campaign against me over a boundary dispute involving exactly 14 inches of soil, and an actual formal hearing in front of the garden's board. And how the whole ridiculous saga ended with her being voted out and me somehow ending up in charge of the exact committee that had made my summer miserable. Some background for anyone who's never been part of one of these community garden setups. Ours is run by a nonprofit that leases plots to residents for a modest annual fee, 20 by 20 foot sections marked with wooden stakes and, in theory, respected boundary lines, overseen by a volunteer plot committee that resolves disputes, assigns new plots, and generally keeps the peace among 60-some households who take vegetable growing considerably more seriously than you'd expect from a hobby that mostly produces zucchini nobody asked for. The chairwoman of that committee, I'll call her Vivian, had held the position for, I believe, 6 consecutive years by the time my dispute with her started, a position of genuinely minimal formal power that she nonetheless wielded with the intensity of someone running a small nation-state. My plot happened to be directly adjacent to hers, and at some point during my second season there, I extended my tomato cages slightly, encroaching, by her measurement, 14 inches into what she insisted was her side of the boundary stake line, though my own measurement, taken with an actual tape measure rather than vibes, put the encroachment closer to 4 inches, still technically over the line, but a considerably less dramatic violation than the 14 inches she kept citing to anyone who'd listen. I offered, genuinely, to move the cages back immediately once she raised it, thinking this would be a 2-minute conversation. It was not a 2-minute conversation. Vivian wanted a formal measurement, conducted, she insisted, by an actual committee member other than herself to maintain what she called impartiality, despite being the committee chairwoman raising the complaint in the first place. A contradiction that struck me as odd even in the moment, but that I decided wasn't worth arguing about given how strongly she felt about it. The formal measurement happened, confirmed something closer to my own 4 to 6 inch estimate rather than her 14, and I moved my cages that same afternoon. I assumed, again, that this resolved things. It did not resolve things. Over the following several weeks, I started noticing my tomatoes disappearing at a rate that outpaced anything a normal garden visitor might reasonably take as a friendly sample. Not the occasional single tomato a passerby might grab with a guilty grin, but entire clusters vanishing overnight, consistently from the specific plants closest to the boundary line that had originally been in dispute. I want to be clear that I did not immediately assume Vivian was personally stealing my tomatoes, since that felt like an escalation in accusation I wasn't prepared to make without evidence. But I did start mentioning the pattern to a couple of other plot holders, mostly just venting about garden theft in general, and got, in response, a few raised eyebrows, and one specific comment from an older gentleman 2 rows over who said, delicately, that he'd noticed similar things happening to other people's plots that happened to border Vivian's over the years, always following some kind of disagreement, and always resolving itself once that specific disagreement had been sufficiently, if never formally, won by Vivian in whatever way she'd decided constituted victory. Armed with this extremely unofficial oral history from a man who'd apparently been watching this exact pattern play out for years with the weary amusement of someone who'd simply decided it wasn't worth the fight, I did something I'm only slightly ashamed of, which is set up a small, inexpensive trail camera, the kind people use for spotting deer, aimed at my tomato plants, purely to settle my own curiosity rather than with any specific plan for what I'd do with whatever I found. I found Vivian, on camera, at roughly 11 at night, on 3 separate occasions over the following 2 weeks, calmly harvesting a meaningful quantity of my tomatoes directly into a canvas garden bag she was, notably, also using in her own plot during the day, meaning this was not some anonymous nighttime theft I could have mistaken for anyone else. This was clearly, unmistakably, our garden committee's own chairwoman helping herself to my crop under cover of darkness, apparently as some kind of ongoing, unspoken continuation of a boundary dispute she considered herself to have lost. I want to describe the specific decision I made at this point, because I genuinely debated a few different paths. I could have confronted her directly and privately, which felt likely to just produce another round of denial and escalation, given how the boundary dispute itself had gone. I could have simply let it go, accepting a certain amount of tomato loss as the tax of gardening next to Vivian. Instead, I decided to bring it, calmly and with actual video evidence, to the Gardens Board, the nonprofit oversight body 1 level above the volunteer plot committee Vivian chaired, specifically because I felt like this pattern, if the older gentleman's account was accurate, had likely been going on for years across multiple plot holders who'd simply never had the specific proof or the specific motivation to escalate it that far. The board meeting where I presented this was, I will be honest, one of the more entertaining evenings of my summer, watching Vivian's face as 3 separate clips of herself calmly filling a canvas bag with my tomatoes played on a laptop screen in front of the full board and, since these meetings are open to any garden member who wants to attend, a genuinely impressive turnout of fellow plot holders, who had apparently been waiting years for exactly this kind of evening. Her defense, delivered with a straight face that I have to grudgingly respect, was that she believed, in good faith, that any produce grown within what she still maintained was technically her 14 inches, despite the independent committee measurement months earlier having settled that dispute in my favor, belonged to her regardless of where my tomato cages currently sat. A defense that fell apart almost immediately once a board member pointed out that even under her own disputed 14-inch theory, the vast majority of the tomatoes visible in the footage were clearly harvested from well within the undisputed portion of my plot. several feet from any boundary line under any measurement either of us had ever proposed. The board's resolution was, honestly, more thorough than I expected going in. Beyond addressing my specific tomato situation, which resulted in Vivian being asked to reimburse me a modest but symbolically satisfying amount for the lost produce, the older gentleman who'd first mentioned the pattern to me, once he saw how this played out, came forward himself with his own account from a few seasons earlier involving a similar boundary dispute and a similarly mysterious pattern of missing squash, followed by 2 more plot holders over the following weeks, once word spread through the garden that this kind of complaint was actually being taken seriously rather than dismissed as petty squabbling beneath the board's attention. That accumulation of multiple, similar accounts across several years, combined with actual video evidence in my specific case, led the board to hold a formal vote on Vivian's continued position as plot committee chair, a vote that removed her from that role, though notably not from garden membership entirely, since stealing produce from a neighboring plot, while a genuine violation of the garden's code of conduct, didn't rise to a level the board felt warranted full expulsion, a decision I actually agreed with even in my moment of vindicated triumph, since I don't think anyone involved wanted this to escalate into something disproportionate to what was, at the end of the day, a dispute over vegetables. I want to get to the genuinely absurd coda of this whole saga, which is that, in the committee restructuring that followed Vivian's removal, several fellow plot holders, apparently having found the entire tomato camera saga both impressive and reassuring evidence, that I'd actually pursue a dispute properly, rather than just quietly seething about it, nominated and then elected me as the new plot committee chair. A position I did not seek, did not particularly want, and have now held for 2 seasons, spending considerably more of my gardening time than I ever expected mediating boundary disputes with the specific, hard-won institutional knowledge that sometimes the person complaining loudest about someone else's boundary violation is the one you should be quietly setting up a trail camera to watch. Vivian and I want to note for the sake of a slightly less petty ending than the rest of this story deserves, actually on reasonably cordial terms these days, still gardening in adjacent plots, having had, eventually, one actual honest conversation about the whole thing where she admitted, with what felt like genuine if belated embarrassment, that the entire pattern had started years earlier over an entirely different, now-forgotten dispute, and had just sort of become an ingrained, almost unconscious habit she'd never seriously examined until a camera made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise, even to herself. My tomatoes, for what it's worth, have been entirely, completely safe ever since. Story 7. My mother's longtime financial advisor talked her into replacing her stable, decades-old whole life insurance policy with a new one 4 separate times over about 6 years, each time citing some compelling-sounding new feature or better rate, and each time collecting a new round of upfront commission, while my mother's actual policy value, once I finally sat down and traced the full history, had been steadily eroded by surrender charges and new policy fees to the point where she had paid in far more over those 6 years than her current policy's actual cash value reflected. I want to explain the specific mechanism here, since this is a recognized and regulated form of financial misconduct, with an actual name, insurance churning or twisting, referring to an advisor persuading a client to repeatedly replace an existing insurance policy with a new one, not because the replacement genuinely serves the client's best interest, but because each new policy sale generates a fresh, substantial upfront commission for the advisor, commissions that are considerably higher on a brand new policy than any ongoing servicing compensation an advisor would earn simply maintaining a client's existing, already established policy. My mother had originally purchased her whole life policy decades earlier, a policy that, left alone, would have continued accumulating cash value steadily over her lifetime according to a well-understood, stable structure. Her advisor, I'll call him Gary, had managed her broader finances for close to 15 years by the time this pattern started, a relationship built on real trust, since he'd handled her accounts competently, as far as she could tell, through her husband's death and her own transition into retirement. The first replacement happened when my mother was in her late 60s, presented by Gary as an opportunity to move into a newer policy structure, offering better long-term growth potential and lower ongoing fees. A pitch that included real-seeming illustrations, projected value charts showing the new policy outperforming her existing one over time, based on assumptions about future interest crediting rates that, I later learned, are precisely the kind of forward-looking, non-guaranteed projections that regulators specifically scrutinize in churning cases, since they can be structured to look considerably more favorable than what actually, realistically materializes once a policy is in force. I want to be honest that none of us, myself included, thought anything of that first replacement at the time, since a financial advisor recommending an occasional policy adjustment as products and rates evolve is not inherently suspicious, and my mother trusted Gary's judgment completely, as she'd had every reasonable reason to for over a decade by that point. The pattern repeated again roughly 2 years later, then again about 18 months after that, and a fourth time just over a year before I actually started looking closely at what had happened, each time with a similar pitch, a new product with some specific improved feature, and each time, unbeknownst to any of us at the time, triggering both a surrender charge on the policy being replaced, a penalty most whole life policies impose for cashing out or replacing coverage within a certain number of years of purchase, and a fresh round of upfront commission for Gary on the new policy being sold. I started paying closer attention only after my mother mentioned, during an unrelated conversation about her overall retirement finances, that she was a little confused about why her current policy's cash value felt lower than she'd expected, given how long she'd been paying into some version of life insurance coverage. A comment that, on its own, might not have triggered much scrutiny from me, except that I happened, professionally, to work in an adjacent field where I'd developed at least a baseline familiarity with how insurance replacement and surrender charges typically function, enough to know that her comment was worth actually digging into rather than dismissing. I requested, with my mother's permission and involvement throughout, complete documentation for every policy she'd held with Gary's firm over the full period, including the original illustration documents provided at each replacement, the actual surrender charges applied at each transition, and a complete accounting of commissions Gary had earned across each transaction, which insurance companies are generally required to disclose to policyholders upon request, even if that disclosure isn't automatically provided as part of routine account statements. Once I actually laid out the complete financial picture across all 4 replacements, the pattern was stark, in a way that felt genuinely upsetting once fully visible. Each replacement had triggered a surrender charge, cumulatively totaling several $1,000s in penalties alone across the 4 transitions, on top of which each new policy's cash value accumulation effectively restarted from a lower base every single time. Since whole life policies are generally structured with the bulk of early premium payments going toward acquisition costs and commissions rather than cash value growth, meaning restarting that clock 4 separate times over 6 years had prevented my mother's money from ever actually benefiting from the longer-term, more favorable cash value growth curve that holding a single policy over that same period would have produced. The commission detail, once I actually saw the numbers laid out clearly, was the part that made this feel less like a series of well-intentioned but ultimately unfortunate financial decisions, and more like a deliberate pattern benefiting Gary considerably more than it ever benefited my mother. Each replacement had generated a substantial upfront commission for him, commissions that, combined across 4 transactions, represented an amount that, when I actually calculated it against her cumulative surrender charges and lost cash value growth, made clear that Gary had profited significantly and repeatedly from decisions that had left my mother's actual financial position measurably worse than if she'd simply kept her original policy from decades earlier untouched the entire time. I want to describe the specific mix of emotions in confronting this, since my mother, once she saw the full picture I'd assembled, was genuinely devastated in a way that went beyond just the financial loss. Having trusted Gary completely for over 15 years, and having recommended him warmly to several friends over that same period, meaning this discovery also carried a real weight of feeling she'd unknowingly steered other people toward someone who may well have been doing something similar to them. I filed a formal complaint with our state's insurance department, which specifically regulates and investigates exactly this category of misconduct, providing the complete documentation trail, the 4 replacement transactions, the surrender charges, the commission disclosures, and the illustration documents from each sale showing the specific projected benefits used to justify each replacement, framed specifically as a pattern consistent with churning rather than any single, isolated instance of a possibly reasonable policy update. The insurance department's investigation, once opened, requested Gary's complete transaction history across his full client base, not just my mother's account, specifically to determine whether this pattern appeared broadly across multiple clients or was isolated to her situation specifically, since a documented pattern across many clients carries considerably more regulatory weight and suggests a systematic practice, rather than a single relationship that happened to go wrong. That broader review, according to what was eventually shared with us as part of the proceeding, identified several other clients, predominantly older, long-tenured clients similar in profile to my mother, with comparable patterns of repeated policy replacement over a similar multi-year window, a finding that moved this from an individual dispute into a formal disciplinary proceeding against Gary's insurance producer license. The insurance department's disciplinary action, once the investigation concluded, found a pattern of churning in violation of state insurance regulations, specifically prohibiting policy replacement recommendations that are not demonstrably in a client's best interest, resulting in the suspension and eventual revocation of Gary's insurance license, along with an order requiring restitution to affected clients, calculated based on the documented surrender charges and lost cash value growth attributable to the pattern of unnecessary replacements. For my mother specifically, that restitution process, once fully calculated by the insurance department's own actuarial review, comparing her actual policy history against a reasonable projection of what her original, decades-old policy would have accumulated had it simply been left in place, resulted in a payment covering a meaningful portion, though I want to be honest, not the complete full theoretical value, of what the churning pattern had cost her over those 6 years, funded through Gary's errors and omissions insurance coverage that insurance producers are generally required to carry specifically to cover exactly this kind of claim. We also, separately, moved my mother's remaining accounts to a new, independent advisor, one specifically recommended through a fee-only financial planning association rather than through any commission-based referral network, a distinction I did not fully appreciate the importance of before this experience. Since a fee-only advisor's compensation structure removes the specific financial incentive that made repeated policy replacement so attractive for someone like Gary in the first place, being paid a flat or percentage of assets fee regardless of which specific products a client holds, rather than earning a fresh commission every time a client can be persuaded to switch into something new. I want to end on the thing that I think matters most for anyone with an aging parent who has a long-time relationship with a single financial advisor, however trusted and however long that relationship has existed. Ask, periodically, and specifically, whether any insurance policy has been replaced or restructured recently, and if so, request the actual surrender charge and commission documentation for that specific transaction, comparing it honestly against what the previous policy's own long-term trajectory would likely have produced if simply left in place. My mother trusted Gary for 15 years, reasonably, based on years of what felt like solid, competent service, and it took one offhand comment about a confusingly low cash value, followed by several hours of actually pulling and comparing documents most people never think to request, to reveal a pattern that had been quietly and repeatedly enriching him at her direct expense the entire time. Story 8. I volunteered at a nonprofit thrift store for almost 2 years before I figured out that the store manager had been quietly pulling valuable donated items, jewelry, first edition books, a couple of pieces of genuine antique furniture, out of the regular donation intake before they ever reached the sales floor, reselling them for her own personal profit through an online account under a different name, while the store itself, whose entire mission was funding a local family services program, kept reporting disappointingly flat revenue that the board attributed to general thrift retail struggles rather than anything happening internally. I want to explain the donation intake process, because understanding the specific point where this diversion happened matters for how it eventually got caught. Donations came in constantly, dropped off by community members, sorted initially by volunteers like me into rough categories: clothing, housewares, books, and a separate holding area for anything that looked like it might have genuine resale value beyond typical thrift pricing: jewelry, collectibles, higher-end furniture, items that were supposed to get a more careful evaluation before pricing, sometimes researched online for comparable sale prices, sometimes set aside for a periodic specialty online sale the store ran for its higher value items specifically. That specialty evaluation holding area, it turned out, was exactly where the manager, I'll call her Denise, had positioned herself as the sole person with regular, unsupervised access, since evaluating and pricing higher value donated items had, over time, become something she handled personally rather than delegating to volunteers, a division of labor that made complete sense on its face, since accurately valuing a piece of genuine antique furniture, or a potentially valuable piece of jewelry, does require some specific knowledge most volunteers, myself included, simply didn't have. I started noticing something felt off, almost by accident, through a conversation with another longtime volunteer who mentioned, casually, that a donor she personally knew had dropped off what the donor described as her late mother's jewelry collection, including several pieces the donor believed were genuinely valuable based on family history and some rough appraisals done years earlier, and that the donor had been mildly disappointed, checking back a couple months later out of curiosity, to see none of those specific pieces featured in the store's periodic specialty online sale, which she'd been looking forward to seeing since she liked the idea of her mother's things going to genuinely interested buyers rather than being priced arbitrarily on a general shelf. That comment stuck with me, mostly because I remembered, vaguely, actually being present the day that specific donation came in, and remembered Denise personally taking custody of it for evaluation, the standard process for anything in that category, which meant, if none of it had ever appeared in any subsequent specialty sale, either it was still sitting somewhere waiting for evaluation months later, which seemed unlikely given how promptly Denise usually processed that specific holding area, or it had gone somewhere else entirely. I want to be honest that I did not immediately assume theft, since there were plausible innocent explanations. Perhaps the items had been evaluated and determined to be less valuable than the donor's family history suggested, and simply priced and sold quietly on the regular floor, rather than featured in a specialty sale, a mundane possibility that didn't require any wrongdoing at all. But the specific detail nagging at me was that Denise, as store manager, had periodically mentioned, in casual conversation among volunteers, that she did some personal reselling of her own household items through an online marketplace account as a hobby, a fact she'd shared openly and that nobody had thought twice about, until this specific coincidence started making me wonder whether her personal reselling hobby and the store's disappointing revenue from higher value donated items might be connected. I did something I want to be honest felt uncomfortable at the time, searching for Denise's personal online reselling account, which she'd mentioned by name in passing during a volunteer lunch months earlier, and looking through her actual sales history and current listings. I found, among a genuinely large number of ordinary secondhand household items that looked entirely consistent with an innocent personal hobby, several specific pieces that matched, closely enough that I felt real confidence rather than mere coincidence, descriptions and, even in a couple of cases, photographs I recognized from having personally sorted or seen items during our store's own intake process months earlier, including what appeared to be at least 2 pieces from that same jewelry donation the other volunteer had mentioned. I want to describe how carefully I tried to approach this next step, since accusing a well-liked, long-tenured manager of stealing from a charity based on my own amateur comparison of online listing photos felt like something I needed to handle through the organization's actual governance structure rather than through any direct confrontation of my own. I brought what I'd found, specifically the comparison between Denise's personal account listings and my own recollection of specific store donations, to a member of the nonprofit's board of directors I knew personally and trusted, rather than to Denise directly or to any other staff member who might report to her. The board member took this seriously immediately, which I was grateful for, and, working with another board member with some relevant financial oversight background, arranged for a more formal, careful review before anyone approached Denise directly, specifically pulling the store's donation intake logs for the specific window in question, comparing what had been logged as received in that specialty evaluation category against what had actually appeared in subsequent sales, whether on the general floor or in the periodic specialty online sales the store ran. That internal review found a gap that, once properly documented, was considerably larger than the single jewelry donation that had originally caught my attention. Over roughly the prior 18 months, a meaningful number of items logged into the specialty evaluation category, based on the store's own donation intake records which volunteers, including myself, had filled out at the point of drop-off before handing items over for Denise's evaluation, simply never appeared anywhere in the store's subsequent sales records, whether floor sales or specialty sales, a discrepancy the board's review characterized as consistent with items being diverted before ever reaching any actual sale channel the nonprofit itself controlled or benefited from. Once the board had this documented internal discrepancy, they engaged a forensic accountant, funded through an emergency board decision, given the seriousness of what the internal review had already suggested, to conduct a full, proper investigation, comparing the complete donation intake logs against complete sales records across the full period, and separately, working with an attorney, formally requesting Denise's own personal online marketplace sales history through the platform's own information request process once there was sufficient documented internal basis to justify that step. The forensic accountant's full findings, once complete, identified a pattern spanning just over 2 years, considerably longer than the 18-month window the board's initial internal review had covered, involving jewelry, several first-edition books, and at least 3 pieces of genuine antique furniture, with a combined estimated resale value, based on actual sale prices found on Denise's personal account where items could be matched with reasonable confidence to specific donation records, of just over $26,000, a sum that, distributed across 2 years, represented a meaningful and sustained diversion of resources, specifically intended to fund the nonprofit's family services programming. Denise was confronted with these findings by the board directly, and, according to what I learned afterward from the board member I'd originally brought my concerns to, did not offer any credible alternative explanation once presented with the specific matched items and the donation intake records establishing their origin, resigning immediately once confronted, rather than continuing to work through what would clearly have become a formal termination process. The nonprofit's board made the decision to pursue this criminally rather than simply accepting a quiet resignation, given both the significant amount involved and the specific breach of trust inherent in stealing from donations intended for vulnerable families the organization served, filing a police report and cooperating fully with the resulting investigation, which led to Denise being charged with theft, given the clear documentation the forensic accounting review had established, connecting specific donation records to specific matched sales on her personal account. She ultimately pleaded guilty rather than contest the charges, given how clearly documented the pattern had become once properly investigated, receiving a sentence that included a restitution order for the full identified amount, along with a probationary term, though I want to be honest, as is common with restitution orders against an individual defendant, that actual recovery has been slow and partial, paid gradually as her limited financial circumstances allow, rather than any kind of immediate full recovery for the organization. The board, in the aftermath, implemented several new internal control measures specifically targeting the vulnerability this whole situation had exposed, requiring any item designated for the specialty high-value evaluation category to be logged, photographed, and reviewed by at least 2 people rather than 1, and instituting a periodic, independent reconciliation, comparing donation intake logs against actual sales records on a regular quarterly schedule, rather than the informal, entirely trust-based system that had allowed one person's unsupervised access to that specific category to go unchecked for over 2 years. I want to end on the thing that still sits with me most from this entire experience, which is how completely ordinary and unremarkable Denise's personal online reselling hobby seemed for the entire time I knew her, mentioned casually and openly in a way that never once, until that one specific offhand comment from another volunteer about a disappointed donor, gave any of us reason to look closer at what exactly was moving through that account. If you volunteer or work anywhere handling donated goods or any kind of high-value inventory with a single person given primary unsupervised evaluation authority, however trusted and well-liked that person is, I'd encourage advocating for exactly the kind of second-person verification and periodic independent reconciliation our organization only built after the fact. Since the actual cost of implementing that kind of basic oversight from the beginning is genuinely minimal compared to what 2 years of unchecked trust ultimately allowed to happen, right under all of our well-meaning, entirely unsuspecting noses. Story 9. A group of 6 guests rented my 2-bedroom vacation rental for a bachelorette weekend, left it with a shattered patio door, cigarette burns across a couch I'd had reupholstered only months earlier, and a stain on the carpet that turned out, once professionally tested, to be red wine ground so deeply into the fibers that the entire carpet needed replacing. Then, once I filed a legitimate damage claim through the platform, the booking guest turned around and filed a credit card chargeback disputing her entire stay as fraudulent, forcing me to fight a battle on 2 fronts simultaneously just to get compensated for damage that photographic and forensic evidence made completely undeniable. I want to walk through the actual discovery of the damage first, since establishing a clear, immediate, well-documented record of the property's condition turned out to matter enormously for everything that followed. I do a standard walkthrough after every guest checkout, photographing the property systematically, the same rooms and angles every time specifically so I have a consistent baseline to compare against. A habit I'd developed years into hosting after an earlier, smaller dispute taught me how much documentation matters when any disagreement arises. The damage from this specific booking was, unfortunately, not subtle. The patio door's glass panel was cracked through in a spiral pattern, consistent with a significant impact, later confirmed by a glass repair technician as almost certainly caused by something being thrown or forcefully struck against it, rather than any accidental bump. The couch had several distinct circular burn marks consistent with cigarettes being extinguished directly against the fabric, in a property where my listing clearly and prominently states no smoking is permitted anywhere on the premises. And the carpet stain, which I initially assumed might be treatable with professional cleaning, turned out, once a carpet cleaning technician actually assessed it in person, to have penetrated deep enough into the padding beneath the carpet itself that professional cleaning would not resolve it, requiring full replacement of both the carpet and the padding underneath across that entire room. I filed a damage claim through the platform's official resolution process, providing my systematic before and after photo comparison, the glass repair technician's written assessment, and the carpet cleaning company's assessment explaining why cleaning alone would not resolve the staining, along with itemized repair and replacement quotes for each specific piece of damage, totaling just under $3,200. The guest, once notified of the claim as part of the platform's standard resolution process, which requires giving the booking guest an opportunity to respond, disputed the claim entirely, denying any of the described damage had occurred during her group's stay, and suggesting, without any specific alternative explanation, that the damage must have existed before her booking or occurred afterward through some other party's use of the property. I want to describe why that denial did not hold up well once actually examined against my documentation, since I think the specific evidentiary comparison matters. My pre-check-in photos, taken the same morning her group arrived, clearly showed an intact patio door, an undamaged couch, and clean carpet with no staining whatsoever. My post-checkout photos, taken within hours of her group's departure and before any other guest had booked or entered the property, showed all 3 specific damage issues already present. That tight timeline, pre-arrival photos showing no damage and post-departure photos taken before any subsequent booking showing clear damage, left essentially no room for the damage happened before or after my stay argument to hold up under any reasonable scrutiny. The platform's resolution team, reviewing both my documentation and her denial, ruled in my favor on the damage claim itself, approving compensation for the full amount based on the clear, well-documented evidence trail. I want to note this is the point where I believed, reasonably, that this specific dispute was essentially resolved, a legitimate damage claim, properly documented, ruled on fairly by the platform's own process. What happened next is the part of this story I think is genuinely important for other hosts to understand, since it represents a distinct and increasingly common secondary tactic beyond simply disputing a damage claim directly through the platform. About 2 weeks after the platform's damage claim ruling, I received notification from my payment processor that the guest had filed a credit card chargeback disputing the entire original booking charge, not the damage claim specifically, but her original payment for the stay itself, citing the transaction as unauthorized or fraudulent, a claim that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual substance of the damage dispute, and instead represented an entirely separate attempt to recover money through her card issuer rather than through the platform's own resolution process she'd already lost. I want to explain why this specific tactic is so frustrating and, frankly, effective for guests willing to use it, since a credit card chargeback operates through an entirely different system and set of rules than a platform's internal resolution process. Meaning a guest who loses a legitimate dispute on the merits through one channel can simply pivot to a different channel entirely, forcing the host, or in this case the platform itself as the party processing the original payment, to fight essentially the same underlying dispute a second time from scratch, under a different set of procedural rules. The platform, to their credit, has a dedicated process for handling exactly this kind of secondary chargeback dispute, since hosts are not directly responsible for fighting card network chargebacks themselves. That responsibility falls to the platform as the actual payment processor of record. But I still needed to provide, once again, the complete evidence package, my systematic photo documentation, the repair and cleaning assessments, and, critically, the platform's own prior ruling on the original damage dispute, which itself became powerful supporting evidence in the chargeback fight, since it demonstrated that an independent, neutral third-party review process had already examined this exact same underlying dispute and found clearly in my favor. I want to describe the specific frustration of watching this play out over the following several weeks, since a chargeback dispute process operates on its own timeline entirely separate from anything a host has direct visibility into or control over, meaning I spent a genuinely anxious stretch simply waiting to hear whether the platform's evidence submission to the card network would be found sufficient, with no ability to directly influence or accelerate that specific decision once my documentation had been submitted. The chargeback was ultimately denied in the platform's favor, meaning the guest's card issuer, reviewing the platform's submitted evidence including the prior legitimate damage claim ruling, determined the original charge had been valid, and the chargeback claim was not substantiated, a resolution that preserved my original damage compensation and closed out this specific guest's second attempt at recovering money through an entirely improper channel. I want to be honest that this entire process, from initial checkout discovery through final chargeback resolution, took close to 4 months, a genuinely long stretch of uncertainty for what was, at its core, a straightforward, well-documented damage claim that should never have required fighting on 2 completely separate fronts to actually resolve. I reported the guest's account to the platform separately from the damage claim and chargeback processes themselves, specifically flagging the pattern of both denying clear, documented damage and then pursuing an entirely separate, procedurally improper chargeback attempt after losing the legitimate dispute process, since platforms do maintain internal records of guest behavior patterns that can affect future booking eligibility, and I felt strongly that other hosts deserved whatever protection that internal flagging might provide going forward. I want to spend the last part of this on what I actually changed about how I host, since I think the practical lessons matter more than the specific outcome of this one dispute. I now do a comprehensive, dated, systematically organized photo walkthrough before every single check-in and after every single checkout, without exception, covering the same specific angles and areas every time, stored in a clearly organized, dated folder structure rather than just scattered photos on my phone, specifically so that if any dispute ever does arise, I have an immediate, clear, chronologically organized evidence trail rather than needing to reconstruct one under pressure once a claim is already contested. I also now specifically retain, for at least 6 months after any booking involving a security deposit or damage claim of any real significance, all supporting professional assessments and repair quotes in an organized file specifically tied to that booking's dates and guest information. Precisely because I learned, through this experience, that a legitimate damage claim victory through a platform's internal process does not necessarily mean the matter is fully closed, and having that same evidence readily organized and available months later, in case a secondary chargeback dispute arrives well after you believed the matter fully resolved, made an already stressful process considerably more manageable the second time this exact pattern happened to me, with a different, unrelated guest roughly a year later. A dispute that resolved in a fraction of the time this first one took, purely because I already had my documentation habits fully established, rather than needing to build them under pressure for the first time again. Story 10. I got charged a $150 cleaning fee for supposedly vomiting in a rideshare driver's car during a ride I remember clearly as being short, sober, and completely uneventful, and the photo he submitted as evidence, which the app initially accepted at face value, turned out, once I actually looked closely at it, to be a stock photo you could find through a basic reverse image search. Part of what I eventually discovered was a repeated pattern this specific driver had been running against multiple riders. I want to describe the ride itself first, since I think the mundane, unremarkable nature of it matters for understanding how genuinely confused I was to receive this charge at all. It was a short ride home from a work event, maybe 15 minutes, during which I had exactly one drink over the course of a 2-hour work function, and was, by any reasonable measure, entirely sober, alert, and unremarkable as a passenger, chatting briefly with the driver about traffic, and getting out at my destination without incident. The cleaning fee charge appeared on my account roughly 2 hours after the ride ended, $150, with an attached photo showing a significant mess on what was described as the vehicle's back seat. I remember staring at that photo genuinely confused, since nothing about the ride I'd just taken involved any mess whatsoever, and my first instinct, honestly, was to wonder if the charge had simply been applied to the wrong trip or the wrong passenger entirely, a mundane administrative error rather than anything deliberate. I disputed the charge immediately through the app's standard dispute process, explaining clearly that no such incident had occurred during my ride, and received, within about a day, a response essentially upholding the original charge, citing the driver's submitted photo evidence as sufficient documentation under the platform's cleaning fee policy. A response that frustrated me considerably, since it felt like the dispute process had simply deferred entirely to the driver's side of the story, without any real independent scrutiny of the actual evidence provided. I want to describe what actually made me look more closely at that photo, rather than simply continuing to argue my case in the abstract. Something about the specific mess in the image struck me as oddly generic once I sat with it for a while. A composition and lighting that felt more like a deliberately staged photo than a spontaneous, hastily taken picture of an actual unexpected mess a frustrated driver had just discovered in his own car. I ran the image through a reverse image search, more out of a hunch than any confident expectation of finding anything, and found, to my genuine shock, that image, or one extremely visually similar to it, appearing on a couple of unrelated stock photo and general internet content sites, meaning the photo used as evidence against my specific charge either was, or was extremely likely to be, not an actual photo of the driver's real vehicle after my ride at all. I want to describe how I approached escalating this, since simply resubmitting the same basic dispute a second time clearly wasn't going to produce a different outcome given how the first round had gone. I compiled the reverse image search results directly into my follow-up dispute, showing the specific matching or near-identical images found elsewhere online, alongside a clear, direct statement that the submitted evidence appeared to not be an authentic photo of the actual incident being claimed, and specifically requested escalation to a human reviewer with authority to examine photo authenticity rather than simply another pass through what felt like an automated or cursory initial review process. That escalation, framed around the specific, checkable claim that the photo evidence itself was not authentic rather than simply repeating my denial that any mess occurred, got real traction in a way the first round hadn't. A representative from the platform's trust and safety team, rather than customer support generally, reached out directly, requested the specific reverse image search results I'd found, and initiated what they described as a broader review of the specific driver's account. Since a fraudulent cleaning fee claim using a stock or reused photo is a serious violation of platform policy that, once credibly flagged, triggers a review considerably more thorough than an initial one-off dispute typically receives. I want to describe what I learned once that broader review concluded, to the extent the platform was able to share information with me as the reporting party. The investigation found that this specific driver had submitted cleaning fee claims at a rate notably higher than the platform's typical driver base, and that several of those claims, once examined, showed patterns consistent with reused or stock imagery similar to what I'd identified, rather than authentic, unique photos corresponding to each specific claimed incident. This was, in other words, not a one-time lapse in judgment, but an apparent, repeated pattern of using cleaning fee claims as a supplementary income stream, exploiting a policy designed to reasonably protect drivers who do occasionally deal with a genuinely messy or inconsiderate passenger. The platform reversed my specific charge in full once their investigation confirmed the photo issue, and, separately, deactivated the driver's account entirely given the broader pattern their review had uncovered across multiple riders, a consequence that felt considerably more meaningful and satisfying than simply getting my own $150 back, since it meant other riders going forward wouldn't be subject to the same scheme. I want to be honest that I don't know the exact number of other riders affected by this same pattern before my specific dispute triggered the broader review, since the platform, reasonably, does not share other users' specific account or dispute details with me as a separate reporting party. But the fact that a broader pattern existed at all, rather than my situation being an isolated one-off incident, suggests this was a sustained practice rather than a single moment of opportunistic dishonesty, and I have to assume a meaningful number of other riders either never disputed their own charges at all, assuming, as I nearly did myself, that a $150 charge with an attached photo was simply an unfortunate, if confusing, legitimate consequence of a ride they didn't fully remember or paid enough attention to during to be fully certain nothing untoward had happened. I want to spend some time on that last point specifically, because I think it's actually the core vulnerability this entire scheme depends on. A $150 cleaning fee, attached to a photo that looks superficially plausible, is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to dispute with full confidence if you've had even one drink, or if you're simply the kind of passenger who tends to look at your phone rather than closely observing the state of a vehicle's back seat throughout an entire ride, since the claim plays on a rider's own uncertainty about what they might not have noticed, rather than requiring the driver to convince you of something you know with total certainty to be false. I filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission as well, specifically framing this as a pattern of fraudulent charges facilitated through a platform's fee dispute process, since this kind of gig platform fee fraud, while perhaps individually modest in dollar terms, represents exactly the kind of systemic consumer harm regulatory agencies do track as a pattern across complaints, even when no single instance rises to a level that would independently justify significant enforcement action on its own. If you're ever charged a cleaning or damage fee for a rideshare trip you don't believe warrants it, my strongest practical advice, beyond simply disputing the charge itself, is to specifically examine any photo evidence provided as closely as you can and run it through a reverse image search if anything about the composition or context feels even slightly generic or staged. A step that takes only a couple of minutes, and that, in my case, was the single piece of evidence that turned an initially dismissed dispute into a fully reversed charge and a broader account suspension for a driver who had apparently been running this exact scheme against a number of riders before mine happened to be the one who actually looked closely enough to catch it.